beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this guide I'll be sharing my tried and tested traditional German wheat beer recipe, but at the same time offering some hybrid and beyond recipe ideas for those of you who, like me, just love to experiment and tweak. Wheat beers in general are great bases for such tweaking, and clearly some brewers are less concerned about keeping to style and are more interested in creating something experimental and fun. So within this video I'll be putting forward some options here. However, should you simply want a good traditional recipe, then naturally this is provided too. Here is a sneak preview of this beer's base vital statistics, but naturally this can change depending on where you decide to go with your tweaks. This base recipe offers approximately 5% ABV and is very nice as is, but experimenting further can transform it into your vision, which I feel is a great way to go for everyone. Even partially writing a recipe can certainly be much more fun and rewarding than simply following a recipe along. This recipe, like all of my shared recipes, is written by me and can be found in full within the video's description, which is underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer, just above where you have the comments section. You will also find a link to the full recipe on Brewing, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. For the very best results, I strongly suggest that your initial steps will be to convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients. I have an easy guide to doing this on Brewing on my channel as shown on screen now. Within this video, this recipe is being brewed using a Brewzilla 35 litre to the volume of 21 litres or approximately 5.55 US liquid gallons, but as part of the conversion process, this can also be scaled and shaped to suit your own brewing system and volume requirements. Recipe conversion is an essential part of the process for the intended results. Water is also an important area, and I suggest that you plan your water profile ahead. Tweaking your water profile for this recipe will enable you to balance it to what you will prefer. If you brew this recipe without tweaking, then I would recommend that you use the balanced profile, an example of which is shown on screen now from Brewing. Essentially this allows both malt and hops to shine equally, but your water profile should share your vision if you decided to tweak. Let's now dough in and start the mash and take a look at the base vital statistics and grain bill. This recipe uses the classic 50% Pilsner Malt and 50% wheat malt model, but the wheat is spread across wheat malt and flaked wheat for some variation already. Many traditional recipes will simply use regular wheat malt, so already you have a choice to make. Let me explain the reasoning behind mine. Flaked wheat is not malted but naturally contains more starch and has higher levels of protein than wheat malt. The main reason I favour flaked wheat though is due to its enhanced flavour compared to today's wheat malt, which due to the modern malting process has a reduced level of flavour. So really by providing this split of the wheat, I am putting back that lost flavour. Flaked wheat also enhances body and provides a less sweet effect, making it ideal for a more crisp and refreshing end beer. Whichever direction you decide to go in, I suggest that you keep within this wheat to Pilsner aspect of the recipe, as it provides a great base no matter where you decide to take it. In terms of the vital statistics shown at the top here, this FG is based on using Mangrove Jack's Bavarian wheat yeast, which is M20. More on this later. On this basis we have an estimated 5% ABV and a BU-GU ratio of 0.24, which makes this base recipe very much in the middle of the balanced versions of German wheat beer. Especially if you do not use rice or oat hulls, do not be surprised if at first you see some extended overflowing when mashing this amount of wheat. If you wish, you can slow the flow of your pump to minimise this and simply add a couple of 2 to 3 minute stirs in to bring your efficiency back up. It is important to know though that wheat, unlike other brewing grains like Pilsner and Pale Ale malt, is not subject to breeding programs to increase and stabilise its yield, so this can lead to a wider variation of its actual yield. So yes, it is not always easy to predict wheat, but it is better to embrace this variation rather than oppose it, as wheat-based beers are a very tasty part of the beer calendar. The next area to consider is mash temperature. Shown on screen is where I have gone for this recipe by standard, but tweaking this could provide some very different effects. For a thin but very fermentable wort, you could look at a mashing step of 62 degrees Celsius, which is just under 144 degrees Fahrenheit. The more fermentable your wort is, the drier your end beer will be. On the other end of the spectrum here, for a thicker and less fermentable wort, you could consider a mash step of 68 degrees Celsius, which is just over 154 degrees Fahrenheit. This will lend itself to a beer that is not actually sweet as such, but having more body, and it will certainly not be dry. Why not have a play around with mash temperature within your recipe software to see how this changes the estimated final gravity. Do realise though that this is simply estimation and that your whole mash is not going to be the exact same temperature, so there will be some room for variation. Welcome to the reality of brewing. Next, I performed a sparge manually by hand. Due to the weak content and my lack of rice or oat hulls, this took a little longer than usual, but I saw this time investment as another way of increasing efficiency. One core reason to sparge is that we are washing sugars that remain in the grist during this stage, and by adding the filtering assistance of oat or rice hulls, this can easily be tipped into being inefficient. A rushed sparge is simply going to provide you top-up volume, whereas a slow but steady sparge is going to provide you extra gravity too. Personally, my taste buds also detect better flavour within a sparge beer compared to a fast sparge or a no sparge beer. Do your own experimentation to see what your taste buds tell you. Let us now look at the base boil schedule, which provides a great window for choice and tweaking beyond this base recipe. Firstly, I'm using the modern boil time of 30 minutes, but this is simply how I decided to go, and you should simply consider it as an option. For further details about boil times, check out my recent video that explains why boil times traditionally were longer and why many brewers are now just boiling for 30 minutes. Included in this video is a guide for adjustments. Certainly you can use the adjustments to bring this recipe into a 60-minute boil if you prefer it. It is the same process within a recipe calculator, but backwards of course. By standard, this recipe has just one hop addition of Saaz at the start of the boil, which is traditional. However, this is an area that is simply wide open for tweaking, and you can simply wipe the slate clean and replace the entire schedule with something altogether different. For example, with an IPA hop schedule like the one shown on screen now, you can turbocharge this recipe into a hybrid style. This is the hop schedule for my Smoke and Rye IPA, by the way, which will certainly work well with this recipe, but it is literally just one example of where you could take this with simply hops. Naturally, by changing your hops, you will also be changing the bitterness of the recipe. It is important that you counterbalance this with alcohol. The BU-GU ratio is your guide to this with any given styles of recipe. Brewfather, for example, covers many styles of beer with this sort of data, and as such makes recipe decisions easier. If you notice that this balance pushes the beer past the alcohol level that you are happy with, then you will need to reduce the bitterness level instead. Moving on to transfer and yeast pitching now after the boil, and more decisions come our way. If we stay within the traditional German wheat beer recipe, then naturally we'll need a German wheat beer yeast. Within this recipe I've suggested Mangrove Jack's Bavarian wheat yeast M20. If you use this yeast, then you can tweak the flavour it lends to the end beer with temperature. This yeast has a temperature range between 18 to 30 degrees Celsius or 59 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. If you ferment low in this range, then you will stress clove flavours, and if you push into the upper range of temperature, you will push banana and vanilla. If you wish to push these esters more, then try an underpitch, which is a commonly used technique with many other types of yeast too. Some have had great results with up to a 50% underpitch, but naturally such large levels come with a much greater risk of fermentation stalling. This is certainly a great area for experimentation though, at your own risk. Of course, there is nothing stopping you from moving away from a wheat beer yeast altogether and adding in different flavours. For example, I actually fermented this one with Verdant IPA yeast for a twist. Is this still a German wheat beer now then? Actually no, but it is a very nice beer for sure, and that is really all that matters to me, but you should make your own choices. Do note that some yeast choices will change the balance of the beer with their different attenuation rates, so keep your eyes open for how this changes your gravity levels and be ready to adjust as you see fit. Another area that can provide a powerfully flavourful tweak is to add fruit towards the end of your first fermentation. A wheat beer base is just great for this. Easy to use and popular fruit is shown on screen now. Each of these have a high flavour concentration, meaning that you do not need to add too much of each to attain a nice flavour. In short, I would recommend using fruit that has been frozen for at least 3 days, as this will break down the enzymes, readying them for fermentation, but always add fruit that has been thawed into your fermenter, not frozen. In terms of the amount of fruit to add, this really depends on the desired flavour and ABV level, but for these particular types of fruit I would recommend between 1 to 3 kilos of each, depending on what you are looking for use with a 19 litre batch. Guidelines for Imperial are also shown on screen. For full details on how to prepare and use fruit, check out my previous videos that involve fruit, some of which are shown on screen now. Let's now take a look at the final beer, starting with a close-up of the pour. As you can see from this pour footage, this pour is clearer than you would expect from a wheat beer. All I have changed here from a traditional recipe is the boil time, bringing it down to 30 minutes, and I have used verdant yeast. However, I did spend 3 days cold crashing, but no gelatin was used. I should point out that even a raw or no boil beer can be cold crashed clear like this, and that clarity can be achieved without a longer boil time should you wish. This beer has been in the keg for about 14 days at this point at an average temperature of 5 degrees Celsius, which is the equivalent of 41 degrees Fahrenheit. This has been under 12 psi of pressure, which is 0.83 bars, and I am also using this pressure for serving too. Let's now move into my tasting notes, starting with aroma. The aroma here is very clean and fresh with some malt and wheat coming through. There is a hint of citrus coming through too. Flavour. A light yet with fair body tasty ale that has many of the characteristics of a German wheat beer, but with added verdant flavours of apricot and background tropical fruit. I personally much prefer the yeast contribution from verdant to a typical wheat beer yeast with its characteristic banana or clove, but that is just my taste. Judge this for yourself. I also have the following notes. Naturally, this is no longer a German wheat beer, but I am very glad that I kept with the main recipe and just changed the yeast. These are two areas that pair very nicely together. Due to how clear this beer is, the mix is rather confusing to the first time drinker before I tell them that it is a clear wheat beer with fruity yeast. And lastly, here are my final impressions. A great thirst quencher ideal for a hot summer's day when something more tasty and fruity is required compared to a normal wheat beer. More to the point though, what will you choose to change and adapt for your own taste? Let the community and I know in the comments section of this video. Happy tweaking! I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!